Yeah, good day, guys. Today we are still going on our series of Neuro 2, and today we'll be talking about the cerebellum. Okay, so what do you have under our cerebellum notes? Let me get my pen. Let's move. All right. They say that the cerebellum is also known as the little brain. Okay, and it's a structure that is located at the back of the brain. All right, underlying the occipital and the temporal lobes of the cerebral cortex. It is a region of the brain that functions largely outside of the realm of conscious awareness. Okay. Now, although the cerebellum accounts for approximately 10% of the brain volume, it contains about 50% of the total neurons in the brain. That's to tell you the lots of work that the cerebellum does. Now, historically, the cerebellum has been considered a motor structure because cerebral damage leads to impairment in motor control and posture. Okay. Now, because the majority of the cerebellum outputs are part of the motor system. Now, also motor commands are not initiated in the cerebellum. Rather, the cerebellum modifies motor commands of the descending pathways to make movements more adaptive and accurate. This is the cerebral hemisphere, encephalum, and this is the cerebellum that we are focusing on. You could say that the cerebellum just is like just a small part of the brain, okay, but contains about 50% of the neurons in the brain. Now, however, in addition to these well-known functions, there is a growing awareness that the cerebellar system may be involved in other types of learning and also emotional reactivity. Cerebrum consists of narrow, worm-like central body, that's the vermis, and two lateral lobes, alright, that's the right and the left cerebral hemisphere. It also has a superior and inferior vermis. Okay, now be talking about the divisions of cerebellum based on anatomical divisions, phylogenical divisions, and functional divisions. So anatomical divisions of the cerebellum, okay, we say that the cerebellum is divided grossly into the cerebral deep nuclei and the cerebellar cortex. It is also divided into the anterior, posterior, and the flocculonodular lobes. The cerebellum also is also divided into three zones from the medial to the lateral. Okay, we have the vermis, we have the intermediate zone, and the lateral hemisphere. Okay, so let's talk about the phylogenetic divisions of the cerebellum. I think we'll have an overview before we go into the divisions. Okay, so now we'll be talking about the peduncles of the cerebellum. Meanwhile, phylogenetically, we have the paleocerebellum and the new cerebellum. I think I already have a comprehensive video on the divisions of cerebellum anatomically, phylogenetically, okay, and functionally. So, and how about the peduncles of the cerebellum? I would say that the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem by three peduncles. These peduncles are the superior peduncle that connects the cerebellum to connect the cerebellum to the midbrain. All right, and this should be the superior. Okay, you can see here. This is the superior peduncle, cerebellum to the midbrain. Then how about the middle peduncle? We say that it is largest of the peduncles and it connects the pons to the cerebellum. It is the middle peduncle. It connects the pons to the cerebellum. How about the inferior peduncle? We say that it connects the cerebellum to the medulla. Now this is the inferior okay, sorry, this was the middle peduncle. This is the inferior peduncle. It connects the cerebellum to the pons. Okay. The next we'll be talking about we just most important input to the cerebellum is through the middle and the inferior peduncles, and most of the output from the cerebellum is via the superior peduncle. Okay. The next we'll be talking about cerebellar nuclei because they are actually much, and in this topic I think this is the image we'll be dealing with. All right, there's 3 slides ahead, but we'll see how we can be able to navigate through this. Right now, we said that output from the cerebellum originates from the cerebellar nuclei. Thus, a lesion to the cerebellar nuclei has same effect as a complete lesion to the entire cerebellum. Now, these nuclei, they include what? Fastigial nucleus. Alright, so guys, this is the fastigial nucleus, and you can see it's red. Okay, now we say that the fastigial nucleus, you could say that it is most medial. All right, if this is the midline, or sorry, if this is the midline, it is most medial. Right, so now we say that it receives input from the vermis. Of course, you know that the vermis is in the midline. Okay, it receives input from the vermis. Okay, and from the cerebellar afferent that carry vestibular, proximal, somatosensory, auditory, and visual information. It projects to the vestibular nuclei and the reticular formation. Okay. Then next we'll be talking about the interposed nuclei. All right. Now, interposed nuclei. This is nucleus interpositus. That's an interposed nuclei. All right. It's made up of two nuclei. That's a globus nucleus and the emboliform. Okay, so the interposed nucleus comprised of the emboliform and the globus nucleus. Okay, now they are situated lateral. All right, you know the fascia is medial, so away from the fascia is lateral, and also they receive input from the intermediate zone and from the cerebellar afferent that carry input. That carry spinal and proximal somatosensory, auditory, and visual information. They project to the contralateral red nucleus. That's the origin of the rubrospinal tract. Okay. All right. So we'll continue talking on the nucleus, on the nuclei of the cerebellum. Next, we have the dentate nucleus. Here's a dentate nucleus. This is a dentate nucleus. You can see spiral. All right. Now, let's talk about the dentate nucleus. We said that it is the largest of the cerebellar nuclei. All right. It is located lateral to the interposed nuclei. Receives input from the lateral hemisphere and from the cerebellar afferent that carry information from the cerebral cortex via the pontine nuclei. It projects to the contralateral red nucleus and the ventrolateral thalamic nuclei. Then lastly, we'll be talking about the vestibular nuclei. You can see that the vestibular nuclei is not in here, all right? It's a nuclei that is outside the cerebellum, but it's considered a cerebellum nuclei. So the vestibular nuclei, we say that it is located outside the cerebellum in the medulla, all right? Hence, they are not strictly cerebellar nuclei, but they are considered to be functionally equivalent to the cerebellar nuclei because of their connectivity patterns are identical to the cerebellar nuclei. They receive input from the flocculonodular lobe and from the vestibular labyrinth. They project to the various motor nuclei and originate the vestibulospinal tract. Okay, that was the phylogenetical divisions of the cerebellum. We're talking about the physiological that's the functional divisions of the cerebellum. Functionally, we have the vestibulocerebellum, also known as the archicerebellum. It comprises of the flocculonodular lobe and its connection with the lateral vestibular nuclei. And phylogenetically, vestibulocerebellum is the oldest part of the cerebellum. As its name implies, it receives vestibular reflexes such as vestibulo-ocular reflex and postural maintenance. Okay. How about the spinocerebellum? Spinocerebellum is also known as the paleocerebellum. Okay, and it comprises of the vermis and the intermediate zones of the cerebellar cortex, as well as the fastigial and the interposed nuclei. As its name implies, it receives major inputs from the spinocerebellar tract. Its output projects to the rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, and reticulospinal tract. It is involved in the integration of sensory inputs with motor commands to produce adaptive motor coordination. Okay, this is what we spoke about. We spoke about the spinocerebellum, cerebrocerebellum, and the vestibulocerebellum. Okay, And lastly, we'll be talking about the cerebellum, also known as the pontocerebellum. It is the largest functional division of the human cerebellum, comprising the lateral hemispheres and the dentate nuclei. Its name derives from its extensive connections with the cerebral cortex via the pontine nuclei afferent and the ventrolateral thalamus. It is involved in the planning and timing of movements. In addition, the cerebellum is involved in cognitive functions of the cerebellum. All right, so we'll be talking about the cerebellar cortex, not cerebral cortex, cerebellar cortex. I would say that the cellular structure of the cerebral cortex is completely monotonous, right? With every region of the cortex, regardless of its functions and connections, appearing identical. So it is monotonous, they look alike. Therefore, the difference in function from one area to another based entirely on difference in inputs and outputs from the cortex. It is interesting to note that there are more neurons in the cerebral cortex than the rest of the brain combined. Also, there are only 5 different types of neurons in the cortex, and these neurons are arranged in layers, in 3 layers. The memory aid I use for this is G, P, M. Okay, that's the granular cell layer, the Purkinje cell layer, and the molecular cell layer. Okay. Next, we'll be talking of all of these cell types, with the exception of granular cells, use the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. It is also important to know that the Purkinje cells is the only neuronal type that has an axon that leaves the cerebral cortex. The remaining cell types make connections only within this layer, within this thin layer of cerebral cortex, right? Now, and also the cerebral neuronal circuitry. That's this diagram that we'll be talking about. This is the cerebral neuronal circuitry. First of all, we have the Mossy fibers, all right? They are so called because of the tufted appearance of their synaptic contact with the granular cells. You could see that they originate from the pontine nuclei and the spinal cord and the brainstem reticular formation and the vestibular nuclei, and they make excitatory projections onto the cerebral nuclei and onto the granular cells. Okay, you could see that the Mossy fibers from here, they are going to the granular cells and also to the Purkinje cells. Okay, now there is a large degree of divergence in the Mossy fiber granular cells connections, as each Mossy fiber innervates hundreds of granular cells. The granular cells send axons up towards the cortical surface. Now, each axon bifurcates in the molecular layer, sending a collateral in opposite directions. Okay. Now, these fibers called the parallel fibers run parallel to the folds of the cerebral cortex, where they make excitatory synapses with the Purkinje cells. Okay, along the way. Okay. How about the climbing fibers? These are they here. We say that the climbing fibers, so called because their axons climb and wrap around the dendrites of the Purkinje cells. They originate from the olive nuclei, the inferior olive, and make excitatory projections onto the cerebral nuclei and onto the Purkinje cells of the cerebral cortex. Okay, these are the climbing fibers. They originate from the olive nuclei and they project to the Purkinje fibers. Okay, now each Purkinje cells receive a single extremely powerful input from a single climbing fiber. In contrast to the Mossy fibers, the parallel fibers, each climbing fiber contacts only 10 Purkinje cells on average, making about 300 synapses, right, with each Purkinje. Now, thus, the climbing fiber is a restricted but powerful, extremely powerful excitatory input onto the Purkinje cells. Now, let's talk about functions of the cortical cerebellum. There's damping action. This refers to the prevention of exaggerated muscular activity, helping the voluntary movement to be smooth and accurate. The cerebral cortex sends info to the cerebral cortex. The cerebellar cortex sends info to the cerebral cortex to discharge only appropriate signals to the muscles, cutting off extra impulses. Now, there's also control of what ballistic movements. We say that the cortical cerebellum plays a role in the pre-planning ballistic movements, and that's rapid alternate movements while carrying out a skilled work during learning processes. Now, timed and programmed movements. This helps in timing and programming movements, especially during learning processes. It plans the various sequential movements during learning of skilled works like typing. How about servo mechanism? This is the process of correction of disturbances or interference during skilled work. I would say that the cerebellum lets the cerebral cortex to discharge signals which are already programmed and stored at sensory motor cortex. However, if there is any disturbance or interference, the cortical cerebellum immediately sends signals to the cortex and corrects what the movement. Okay, and there's also comparator function. I would say that the cortical cerebellum is responsible for the integration, coordination of various muscular activities. It compares the cortical commands for muscular activity and the actual movements carried out by the muscle. In case of correction of the cortical cerebellum, sends impulse to the motor cortex, right? Now, accordingly, the cerebral cortex modifies the signals to muscles so that the movements become what accurate, precise, smooth. This function is known as what comparator function of the cortical cerebellum. All right, now there's applied physiology here. We say that cerebellar damage lesions. There's decomposition of movements. We say that most of our movements involve the coordinated activity of many muscles, all right, group. Now, and different joints to produce what a smooth trajectory. Now, patients with the cerebellar dysfunction are unable to produce this coordinated smooth movement. Instead, they often break the movements down into their component parts in order to execute what the desired trajectory. Now, for example, touching one's nose requires the coordinated activity of what shoulder, elbow, wrist joints. Cerebellar patients must first perform the shoulder movement, then the elbow movement, and finally the wrist movement in sequence rather than as one. Okay. And there's intention tremor. We say that when making a movement to a target, cerebellar patients often produce an involuntary tremor that increases as they approach the closer target. For example, reaching for a cup, the hand stands out in a direct line towards the cup. As it gets closer, however, the hands begin to move back and forth, okay, as if it is making an attempt to contact the cup. All right. Then there's a dysdiadochokinesia, all right. We say that patients having difficulty perform rapidly alternating movements, such as hitting a surface rapidly. Okay. Finally, we have deficit in motor learning. We say that cerebellar damage causes for deficit in motor learning in both human patients and experimental animals. The vestibulo-ocular reflex allows us to maintain gaze on an object when the head is rotated, and vestibular signals dictate what the head movement and send signals through the cerebellum to the eye muscles to precisely counter the head rotation and maintain a stable center of gaze. The motor command to the eyes must be calibrated precisely with experience, and this calibration appears to be the job of what the cerebellum. Lesions to the cerebellum prevents what adjustment to the reflex. Now, these guys, I think we are done with our class on the cerebellum. All right. So see you guys. It was a whole lot of work, and see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye for now.